Sometimes I catch myself doing something strange in relationships. I try very hard not to be difficult to love. Not too emotional. Not too demanding. Not too complicated. Just easy. Easy to be around. Easy to understand. Easy to stay with. And most of the time, I don't even notice I'm doing it. It shows up in small moments. When I feel upset about something, but I tell myself it's not worth bringing up. When I want reassurance, but I decide I shouldn't need it. When something bothers me, but I convince myself it's better to stay calm and not make things heavier than they already are. So instead of saying what I actually feel, I adjust it. I soften it. I edit it down until it becomes something easier for the other person to handle. Something lighter. Something more convenient. Because somewhere along the way, I learned a quiet rule about relationships. Love stays longer when you are easy to love. Not dramatic. Not intense. Not complicated. Just understanding. Flexible. Low maintenance. And if you do it well enough, relationships feel smoother. People seem more comfortable. There are fewer conflicts. Fewer moments where someone pulls away. But sometimes, when I'm alone, another thought quietly appears. A strange question. If I have to make myself easier to love, what happens to the parts of me that aren't easy? The moments when I feel too much. The moments when I need more patience. The moments when I'm confused, sensitive, or unsure. Because those parts don't disappear. They just stay quieter. Carefully managed. Carefully hidden. And after a while, something subtle begins to happen. You become very good at being easy to love. But you're no longer sure if the love you receive is for who you actually are, or for the version of you that learned how to take up less space. Most of the time, the pressure to be easy to love doesn't appear in big dramatic moments. It shows up in very ordinary situations. Small conversations. Small decisions. Small emotional adjustments that happen so quickly we barely notice them. For example, imagine you're talking to someone you care about and something they say bothers you slightly. Not something huge. Just a comment that lands a little wrong. Maybe they cancel plans at the last minute. Maybe they forget something that mattered to you. Maybe their tone changes during a conversation. You feel the reaction immediately. A small wave of disappointment. Maybe a bit of frustration. For a moment, you consider saying something about it. But then another thought appears almost instantly. It's not a big deal. They're probably tired. I don't want to make this into something unnecessary. And within seconds, the feeling is adjusted. Not fully expressed. Not fully ignored. Just softened enough that the moment passes quietly. On the surface, nothing looks unusual. The conversation continues. The interaction stays smooth. The other person may not even realize anything happened. But internally, something important just occurred. You chose to make the situation easier. Easier for the relationship. Easier for the other person. And sometimes easier for yourself, too. Because bringing things up can create tension. It can make the atmosphere heavier. It can introduce uncertainty. So learning how to smooth moments over can feel like a useful skill. Another place where this pattern appears is when we need reassurance. Maybe you notice the other person feels slightly distant that day. Not dramatically distant. Just a little quieter than usual. Part of you wants to ask, is everything okay between us? But then another thought interrupts. Don't be needy. They're probably just having a long day. You don't want to make things complicated. So instead of asking, you wait. You tell yourself it's better to stay relaxed. Better to give them space. Better to be easy. Again, nothing looks wrong from the outside. You're calm. Patient. Understanding. But inside, the question never fully disappeared. It simply remained unanswered. Sometimes this pattern also shows up when we talk about our own needs. Imagine you're spending time with someone and you feel a little tired. Or overwhelmed. Or emotionally drained. You might want to say, "I think I need a quiet night." Or, "I'm not feeling great today." But if you've learned to be easy to love, another calculation sometimes happens first. You think about how the other person might react. Will they feel rejected? Will they think you're being distant? Will they feel disappointed? So instead of saying exactly what you feel, you adjust the message slightly. You phrase it more carefully. You soften the edges. You make sure it doesn't sound too heavy. Because part of you is always aware of the emotional balance in the room. And you've become very skilled at maintaining that balance. In fact, many people who feel this pressure are extremely good at reading emotional environments. They notice small changes in tone. Small pauses in conversation. Subtle shifts in mood. They quickly detect when someone feels uncomfortable, irritated, or distant. And because they notice those signals early, they often react by adjusting themselves. Speaking more gently. Explaining things more carefully. Avoiding topics that might create friction. From the outside, this behavior often looks like kindness. And sometimes it truly is kindness. But there's a small difference between kindness and constant emotional self-adjustment. Kindness happens when we choose to care about someone. Emotional self-adjustment happens when we feel responsible for keeping the relationship comfortable. And when that responsibility becomes constant, it can slowly shape the way we show up in relationships. We become the person who understands. The person who adapts. The person who doesn't make things harder than they need to be. People often appreciate that. They describe us as calm, easygoing, supportive. And those qualities are genuinely valuable. But there's another side to this pattern that's easy to miss. When someone spends a long time learning how to be easy to love, they also become very careful about the parts of themselves that might feel harder for others to handle. Strong emotions. Confusion. Frustration. Needs that require patience. Those parts don't disappear. They simply get filtered. Carefully managed before they reach the surface. Sometimes this filtering becomes so automatic that we stop noticing it. We think we're simply being mature. Or patient. Or emotionally intelligent. And in many cases, those things are true. But occasionally, the habit runs deeper than we realize. Because the moment something inside us feels complicated, the first instinct isn't always to express it. The first instinct is to ask a quiet question. Will this make me harder to love? If the answer feels like yes, even slightly, the feeling is often adjusted before it fully appears. And over time, that quiet adjustment can become a normal part of how we relate to the people we care about. Not because we want to hide who we are, but because somewhere along the way, we learn that relationships tend to feel safer when we are the person who keeps things easy. One of the most interesting parts about this pattern is how early it starts. Most people don't wake up one day and decide, "I should become easy to love." It develops slowly. Usually in environments where emotional reactions were unpredictable, sensitive, or difficult to navigate. As a child, You begin noticing things about the people around you. Not consciously. Just through repetition. You notice which behaviors bring calm. You notice which behaviors create tension. You notice what makes adults relax, and what makes them withdraw, criticize, or become distant. And because children naturally depend on relationships for safety, the brain becomes very good at learning these patterns. For example, imagine a child who expresses frustration or sadness and receives reactions like, "Don't be dramatic. You're overreacting. That's not a big deal." After hearing responses like that enough times, the child begins adjusting how emotions are expressed. Not because the emotions disappear, but because expressing them fully seems to create discomfort in the relationship. So the child experiments with something else. Less emotion. More calm. More patience. More understanding. And when those behaviors create smoother interactions, the brain quietly registers the lesson. This version of you works better. This version keeps things peaceful. This version doesn't cause problems. Over time, that adjustment becomes part of your personality. You become the person who is easygoing, understanding, flexible. You notice when others are stressed and you adapt quickly. You try not to make things harder than they already are. And because those behaviors often make relationships smoother, people appreciate them. Teachers might describe you as mature. Friends might say you're easy to be around. Partners might say you're very understanding. All of those things sound positive. And many of them truly are. But what often remains invisible is the quiet pressure underneath. The pressure to maintain that role. Because once people become used to a version of you that is calm, patient, and easy to handle, it can feel risky to step outside that version. Imagine a situation where you're genuinely upset about something. Not slightly annoyed. Actually upset. Your first instinct might still be to slow the emotion down, to make sure it doesn't appear too intense. Because part of your mind remembers what usually happens when emotions become heavier. The atmosphere changes. The relationship becomes tense. People become uncomfortable. So instead of letting the emotion move naturally, you begin editing it. You explain things more gently. You reassure the other person while explaining why something bothered you. You add phrases like, "It's not a big deal. I'm probably overthinking. I just wanted to mention it." These small phrases soften the emotional weight of what you're saying. They make the conversation easier to receive. But they also reveal something important. Part of you is still trying to keep the interaction manageable for the other person. Even while expressing something that matters to you. This is where the pressure to be easy to love becomes visible. It's not always about avoiding conflict completely. Sometimes it's about making sure your needs never feel too heavy. Never too complicated. Never too disruptive to the emotional balance of the relationship. For people who learn this pattern early, it often feels completely normal. It feels like maturity, like emotional intelligence, like kindness. And again, some of those qualities are genuinely present. But the key difference is motivation. Are you adjusting because you freely choose to care about the other person? Or are you adjusting because you're afraid the relationship might struggle if you don't? That distinction is subtle, but important. When someone feels internal pressure to remain easy to love, emotional expression often passes through a filter. Before saying something honest, the mind quickly asks, will this create tension? Will this make me seem difficult? Will this change how the other person sees me? If the answer feels uncertain, the emotion is often softened, rephrased, reduced, And over time, this process can become so automatic that it no longer feels like a choice. It just feels like the natural way to behave in relationships. You become the stable one. The understanding one. The person who absorbs small tensions instead of creating them. From the outside, that role can look admirable. But internally, it sometimes carries a quiet cost. Because the more skilled you become at being easy to love, the less space there may be for the parts of you that are not easy. The moments when you are confused, overwhelmed, sensitive, or simply human in ways that require patience from someone else. Those moments don't disappear. They just wait for situations where they finally feel safe enough to exist without being edited first. One of the most subtle consequences of learning to be easy to love is that you start measuring yourself constantly inside relationships. Not in a dramatic way. In small internal calculations that happen almost automatically. For example, during a conversation you might suddenly notice a small change in the other person's tone. Maybe they become quieter. Maybe they take a little longer to respond. Maybe their expression changes for just a second. And immediately your mind begins scanning the moment. Did I say something wrong? Was I too intense? Did I talk too much? Should I change the subject? These questions often appear before the other person has even reacted to anything. Because when you've spent a long time trying to stay easy to love, you become extremely sensitive to small emotional signals. You learn to read pauses, expressions, energy shifts, sometimes even imagined ones. The goal isn't manipulation. The goal is stability. You're trying to keep the interaction smooth, comfortable, safe. So when you sense the possibility of tension, your instinct is to adjust quickly. You might speak more softly. You might laugh something off. You might downplay what you just said, not because you were wrong, but because you want to prevent the moment from becoming heavier than necessary. Over time, this habit can become so normal that you barely notice it. But if you step back and observe closely, you may realize something interesting. You are constantly monitoring how easy you are to be with. Am I being too emotional right now? Am I asking for too much? Am I making this situation heavier than it should be? These questions create a quiet pressure inside the relationship. A pressure to remain balanced, agreeable, manageable. And many people who live with this pattern become incredibly good at it. They become the person others describe as calm, understanding, low maintenance. People often say things like, "You're so easy to talk to. You never create drama. You're very understanding." Those comments feel good to hear. But sometimes they also reinforce the role. Because once you're known as the easy person, it becomes harder to show the moments when you're not. Imagine having a difficult day. You feel tired. Maybe emotionally drained. Maybe something happened that left you unsettled. Part of you wants to say it honestly. "I'm not feeling great today." But another part of your mind starts negotiating. "Don't bring heavy energy. They've had a long day too." You don't want to make things harder. So instead you say something lighter. "I'm just a little tired." Or, "It's nothing, I'm okay." The truth is partially expressed, but not completely. The heavier parts stay inside. Not because you're hiding them intentionally, but because you've learned that relationships tend to run more smoothly when you manage your emotional weight carefully. This same pattern can appear when you need support. Maybe something genuinely bothers you. You want reassurance. You want someone to listen. But before asking for that, the familiar calculation appears again. What if I sound needy? What if they think I'm too sensitive? What if I become harder to love? So instead of asking directly, you handle the feeling alone. You distract yourself. You rationalize it. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. And many times, the moment passes without anyone else knowing what was happening internally. This creates an interesting paradox. The person who feels pressure to be easy to love often becomes extremely supportive to others. They listen carefully. They offer patience. They hold space for other people's emotions. But when it comes to their own emotions, they often apply a stricter standard. They try to keep those emotions lighter, easier, less disruptive. Not because they believe their feelings are unimportant, but because somewhere inside them exists a quiet belief. Love stays when you don't make things too complicated. So they continue doing what they've learned to do well. They smooth situations. They reduce tension. They keep relationships stable. And most of the time, it works. Relationships remain calm. Conversations remain comfortable. But occasionally, in quiet moments alone, a different question appears. If I'm always making sure I'm easy to love, does anyone really know the parts of me that aren't easy? The moments when I feel too much. The moments when I'm unsure. The moments when I need someone else to hold the emotional weight for a while. Because those moments are real too. They simply exist behind a filter that has been carefully protecting the relationship for a very long time. At some point, if you start paying attention to this pattern, something interesting becomes visible. The pressure to be easy to love doesn't only affect what you say. It affects what you allow yourself to feel. Because when you're always trying to keep relationships smooth, your emotional reactions begin passing through a quiet filter. Before a feeling becomes visible, the mind asks a quick question: is this going to make things harder? If the answer seems like yes, even slightly, the feeling is often adjusted. Not suppressed completely. Just reduced. Softened. Translated into something lighter. Imagine you're in a conversation and something genuinely frustrates you. Maybe the other person dismisses something important. Maybe they interrupt you several times. Maybe they respond in a way that feels careless. Your first reaction is natural. A small wave of irritation appears. But almost immediately another thought arrives: don't escalate this. Stay calm. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. So the irritation is quickly reorganized. Instead of saying, "that actually bothered me," you might laugh it off. Or change the topic. Or explain things in a calmer tone than you actually feel. From the outside, the moment looks mature. Controlled. But internally something else just happened. You chose emotional manageability over emotional honesty. And the more often this happens, the more automatic the process becomes. Eventually you stop noticing the adjustment. It simply feels like normal communication. Another place where this pattern becomes visible is when other people show strong emotions. If someone around you becomes upset, stressed, or overwhelmed, you may instinctively shift into stabilizing mode. You listen carefully. You reassure them. You make sure your own reactions remain calm. You try not to add any additional emotional weight to the situation. Again, from the outside this looks like kindness and emotional intelligence. And often it truly is. But sometimes the stabilizing role becomes so familiar that you remain in it even when you need support yourself. You become the person who absorbs tension rather than expressing it. The person who adjusts rather than asking others to adjust. The person who maintains balance even when you are the one who needs someone else to hold it. This dynamic can quietly shape the structure of relationships. Not because anyone forced it to happen, but because you've become extremely skilled at maintaining emotional comfort for everyone involved. And when something works well, people naturally rely on it. They come to expect the calm version of you. The understanding version. The version that doesn't make situations more complicated. Over time, this expectation can create another quiet pressure. Because once people become used to the easy version of you, showing the harder moments can feel unfamiliar. Even slightly risky. Imagine suddenly expressing something raw. Admitting that you feel overwhelmed. Or frustrated. Or deeply uncertain. For someone who is known as emotionally steady, moments like that can feel almost out of character. Not only for others, but for yourself too. You may even feel the impulse to explain the emotion quickly. To reassure the other person that it's temporary. That it's not a big issue. That things are still under control. In other words, even while expressing something real, part of you is still managing how heavy the moment becomes. Because somewhere inside your emotional system, a quiet association formed long ago. Relationships stay stable when you remain manageable. When your emotions don't overflow. When your needs don't feel too demanding. So the mind becomes cautious about letting the full intensity of feelings appear. Not because the feelings are wrong, but because the system learned that emotional intensity can sometimes disturb the balance of connection. And when someone values relationships deeply, preserving that balance becomes a priority. Sometimes even more than expressing everything exactly as it is. But slowly, if you begin noticing this pattern, another realization starts to appear. Being easy to love has helped many relationships survive. But it may also have prevented some parts of you from fully showing up inside those relationships. Not because those parts were unwanted, but because they were never given the space to exist without being adjusted first. And recognizing that is often the moment when something new begins to become possible. The possibility that being loved might not always depend on how easy you make the relationship feel. And when that realization begins to appear, something inside you slowly starts to shift. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a sudden transformation where you stop caring about harmony or suddenly become confrontational. It's much quieter than that. It begins as a small internal permission. The permission to stop editing yourself quite so quickly. Because once you start noticing how often you adjust your reactions, soften your needs, or translate your feelings into something easier for others to handle, a natural question appears. What would happen if I didn't do that every time? Not in an extreme way. Just occasionally. Just enough to let something real pass through without immediately smoothing it out. For example, imagine a simple moment. You're talking with someone you care about, and something they say genuinely bothers you. Normally, you would adjust. You would minimize the reaction. You would protect the comfort of the conversation. But this time, instead of immediately doing that, you pause. You stay present with the feeling for a second longer. And you say something simple. Hey, that actually landed a little heavier for me than you might think. Not aggressive. Not dramatic. Just honest. And in that moment, something important happens. You allow the relationship to encounter the real version of you. Not the edited one. Not the carefully balanced one. Just the real one. For people who are used to being easy to love, this kind of moment can feel strangely vulnerable. Almost like stepping slightly outside of a role that has protected the relationship for a long time. But it also creates something new. Because when you allow real reactions to appear, the relationship has an opportunity to adapt to the full version of you. Not only the manageable parts, the deeper parts too. And this is where many people discover something surprising. The fear that being more emotionally honest will damage the relationship often turns out to be exaggerated. In many cases, the opposite happens. When people finally see the parts of you that were always softened or hidden, the connection becomes more real, more balanced, more mutual. Because now the emotional weight isn't being carried by just one side. Both people are participating in the reality of the relationship. And this doesn't mean abandoning the qualities that made you easy to love in the first place. Your calmness, your empathy, your ability to listen. Those things are valuable. They're part of who you are. But they don't have to exist at the cost of your own emotional presence. Being considerate doesn't mean disappearing. Being understanding doesn't mean minimizing yourself. And being easy to love shouldn't mean constantly reshaping your emotional world so that it fits comfortably inside someone else's expectations. Real relationships aren't built on emotional perfection. They're built on emotional reality. On the ability to show up with moments that are calm and moments that are messy. Moments of clarity and moments of confusion. Moments where you support the other person, and moments where you need them to support you. That balance is what makes relationships alive. And sometimes, the most meaningful shift doesn't happen when you try to become harder to love. It happens when you stop assuming that love requires you to be easier. Because the people who truly connect with you aren't only responding to how manageable you are. They're responding to your presence, your sincerity, your humanity. And humanity isn't always easy. Sometimes it's complicated. Sometimes it's intense. Sometimes it's uncertain. But those are also the moments when connection becomes real. So if you've spent a long time making sure that loving you feels comfortable for everyone else, there's nothing wrong with that. It probably helped many relationships stay stable. It probably made you someone people feel safe around. But maybe there's another possibility worth exploring now. The possibility that you don't have to keep proving how easy you are to love. Because the right connections don't stay only when things are smooth. They stay when the full, unedited version of you is allowed to exist too.